Welcome to the Myrna Method live stream. I'm registered dietitian Myrna Haag. My goal is to bring you impactful nutrition information that can literally change your life. In this video, and I've discussed it before, we're going to address insulin resistance in active people. I want to show you some risks that happen for many of us that we're unaware of. So Sam, if you'll take me to the PowerPoint, let's get this thing rolling. Awesome. So how can exercise hide some of these risk factors, specifically type 2 diabetes, which starts as insulin resistance? How is it hiding the risk not only for older athletes, but even younger athletes who are at risk for insulin resistance and may not be aware of it? If you want to go to the next slide, Sam.
No, go for it.
Okay, perfect. So it starts with insulin resistance. Type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance decades before. Active athletes will have low normal A1C. Everything looks great, but they could be starting on the road for metabolic dysfunction. In their 20s, everything's fine. Starting in the 30s, they can notice some changes in their appetite. It's tougher to lose the weight. They're getting the muffin top. They're getting that body fat weight gain. And they're not necessarily eating more, although their appetite may be increased. They are starting in insulin resistant. Very undetected, but the risk factors grow. Even though it's undetected, there's risk factors to set you up for metabolic disease. As you become older is when these risks start to appear. And I really want to talk about the active older athletes. And I'm not talking about that much older. I'm talking about late 40s, early 50s that have low normal A1Cs, and they're having this metabolic dysfunction that they're not aware of. And this is increasing their risk for type 2 diabetes, type 3 diabetes, which is Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is definitely associated, that is what cognitive decline is, and it's definitely associated with insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. And also diseases that are occurring from the gut microbiome. So we've got a lot of literature really working its way up the workings with a lot of clinicians on how these gut bacteria play a role, not only in metabolic diseases, but with autoimmune diseases as well. And this gut-brain hormonal dysfunction that happens when you get metabolic disease, which really what insulin resistance, obesity, and you don't really even have to be really overweight to be obese, because you can have a high percentage of body fat, which I've talked in podcasts about, skinny fats. So we're going to really dive into this in this video. And also, I don't want to forget about vascular inflammation. So it starts with insulin resistance in your 30s and 40s. Maybe you're gaining a little weight, but by the time you hit your 50s, you've had 2 solid decades of being insulin resistant. You don't even know you have it because everything appears normal. So let's go into the science so that it makes sense to you, because to not talk about the biochemistry of this doesn't help you at all. To sit here and recite, which we see a lot on the internet, why people believe you should eat a certain way or you shouldn't, doesn't help you, because you just believe them because they're wearing a white coat. We got to do better than that. We got to really give you pathology. We really have to show you the science so that it makes sense to you. And that's what we're going to do. So when you eat a carbohydrate, it breaks down to glucose and you release insulin in the blood. And the whole goal is insulin's goal is to attach to a receptor site that sits on a muscle cell. These receptor sites also sit on brain cells. These are the 2 big hogs of glucose. They really want the glucose because muscles want to have the glucose, the sugar, to be able to do active energy. Now, sure, muscles can use fat for energy, but when you're really working energetically, it is much easier to get down to the energy, the ATP, when we're getting it from a sugar molecule than a fat molecule. Not that you can't get it from a fat molecule, but it's more of a slower burn. So we don't want to impede our activity. We don't want to make it less of an active endeavor, whatever you're doing. And also, we want you to be motivated to be active. And by allowing the muscles to have those carbs, we're doing that. But in order for the muscles to get the carbs, they need that hormone insulin to attach to a receptor site who talks to a messenger, talks to another messenger, and brings up the transporter, GLUT transporter number 4. And as soon as that transporter comes to the surface, it's beautiful because the glucose starts coming into the muscle cell, out of the blood, and into the muscle cell. And when the glucose gets into the muscle cell, it combines with water. For every gram of a carb, every gram of glucose, you have 3 grams of water. So you're actually hydrating your body at a cellular level. That's why when you go on a low-carb diet, you can lose a lot of water weight. Because when you get rid of the carbs, you get rid of the water. Bottom line, this is how it works. Also in the brain, we have the same situation. The glucose transporter comes to the surface because there are certain neuronal cells that want the sugar. So this is how it works. The one detail that's going to make a big impact on what I'm about to tell you in this video is you don't need insulin when you're exercising. So when you're out there exercising, what happens is the transporter immediately comes to the surface. Whether you have enough insulin or not, the transporters are ready to bring the glucose from the blood into the muscle for obvious reasons. Because muscles want to have that sugar, especially when you're exercising. Only happens when you're exercising vigorously enough to get the muscles motivated to open up those doors and bring the sugar in. So what we're really saying is for a lot of athletes, every time they go work out, and I want you to keep this in mind because we're coming back to this, they are shuttling the sugar into the muscle. Now let's look at what happens when you get insulin resistance. When you get insulin resistance, the receptor sites that insulin attaches to is all gunked up. It's clogged up. It doesn't work. It's disabled. So insulin can sit there and try all it wants, not only in the muscle cell, but in the brain cell. We also have insulin receptor sites in fat cells. And when they get dysfunctional, they just make the fat cells release more fats, which we'll talk about that. So this receptor site becomes disabled. And why is that? What is disabling these receptor sites? Too much fatty acids in circulation. Too much body fat, because when you have fat cells, they get really large because you're just getting too fat. They release fatty acids in circulation. Maybe you're just eating too many dietary fats, and we're going to talk about that. You're releasing too many fatty acids in circulation. These excess fatty acids differentiate into a type of fat called a ceramide. We're going to talk about these ceramides and explain why this is not such a good thing. But when you get the situation where you get this receptor site clogged up, that transporter never gets the message to come to the surface. So you got a lot of glucose sitting outside the muscle cell, sitting outside the brain cell. And what happens, excuse me, is that glucose makes its way into a fat cell, because fat cells are always open for business. You then start noticing that whenever you eat carbs, you're just gaining weight, which makes sense. It's 30, 40 years old, you're starting with this insulin resistance, and you just can't eat the carbs like you used to. You start getting that belly fat. Well, yes, when you start getting insulin resistance, and remember, when you start with insulin resistance, maybe you're 30 years old, maybe only 10% of these receptors are clogged up. And then 10 years later, we got 30 or 40 of them. That's where you're going to start to really notice it's tougher to lose weight. You're getting a little older. And by the time you're 50 or 60, you could be a full-blown diabetic, because then you have maybe 50 or 60 of these clogged up. Bottom line, what's clogging these up is excess fatty acids. Too much dietary fat, too much body fat is what is called lipid toxicity, which we'll talk about in some of the studies. These are medical journals. Excess fatty acids that accumulate in muscle cells disable the insulin receptor. It isn't that insulin is not doing what it's supposed to. And really, yes, insulin and sugar then become excess in the blood, no doubt. And I am not arguing with the fact a lot of insulin in the blood, a lot of sugar in the blood is not a good thing. Because there's a lot of cells that get washed with all this sugar, and it can be debilitating. It can cause toxicity in cells that weren't designed for all this sugar. So yes, a lot of insulin and sugar in the blood, not disputing that isn't a good thing. What I'm trying to bring to the table is how to fix it. You're given the wrong information. You're given information that will actually make it worse, which I think is why this video is so important. So when we look at this and we're saying, wow, what is this lipid toxicity? What are you saying? I'm telling you as a dietitian, these macronutrients need to be balanced not only for the day, but at the meals. But in this video, we're only going to talk about the macronutrient fat. Because whether I'm talking about protein, fiber, carbs, or fat, it isn't like we just get to make up the amount we should have. There is science why the body regulates itself when these macronutrients are where they're supposed to be. It's just in this video, I'm going to talk about the fat macronutrient. So bottom line, your body would like for you to be healthy to have 20 to 35% of your daily calories from fat. So before I jump into some patient scenarios, let me just show you what that means in case somebody doesn't want to watch the video full on and wants to get right down to that. I don't want to have you wait till the end to get very useful information. So if I'm going to tell you what amount of fat you need to get that 25 to 35%, we're going to base it on your ideal body weight. It's not 35% of the current weight you weigh now, because then you'd be eating way too much fat. It's based on your ideal body weight, because that's how your body's looking at it. So you will take your ideal body weight and divide it by 3. As a dietitian, I just came up with those formulas because I did the math backwards, so you wouldn't have to. That's going to give you 25%, and you can easily add 20 to 30 grams on top of that, and you're going to be within that 25 to 35% range. If your fat grams are 40%, yes, you can have metabolic problems. Why do I know that? Because I'm seeing it in blood tests, which I'm going to show you next. So there is a reason why your body wants you to keep the macronutrients at the percentages they're supposed to be. Not the percentages somebody on the internet says, well, let's just drop these fats, let's just raise these fats to 80%. What they think they're doing is they're helping you with this insulin resistance, and they're actually making it worse. Let me just show you how to get to your ideal body weight, because a lot of people may not know that. Real easy formula. For females, for every inch over 5 feet, you'll add 5 pounds. You'll add that to a base of 100 pounds. For men, every inch over 5 feet, it'll be 6 pounds. So if you're, 5'10", you'll take 10 inches and you'll multiply it by 6 pounds. That's 60 pounds. And you'll add that to 106. In women, it's the same thing, but it's 5 pounds and you'll add it to 100. And basically, you can easily add 10 pounds to that and still be within your range of your leanest body weight for your size. If you're really muscular, you can easily add another 10 or 15 pounds and still be within that range. Bottom line, somebody's 10, maybe 12 pounds over their ideal body weight. I'm always looking at that muscle composition, which is not what this video is about, but that can make a difference and you can still be lean. I just want to throw that caveat in there. All I'm trying to do is get you to a number that makes sense to you so that I can give you, like I said in the beginning of this video, impactful information in nutrition that you can use. So let's look at some patients. Let's look at some lab values. Let's try to make sense why people recommend low-carb diets to begin with. Well, first of all, let's start with why people would recommend a low-carb diet. Well, let's face it. As these sugars begin to raise in the blood, you have high blood sugar, which will show up in a lab test called an A1C, which takes an average of your blood sugar over 3 months. That's just what they do medically to figure out how much sugar was in your blood over 3 months, an average. They find that you've got a lot of sugar in your blood, you get a lot of insulin in your blood, and the first thing they're going to say to you is, let's reduce the sugar. I want you to monitor those carbs. I want you to eliminate the carbs. After all, you don't really feel that good eating carbs. Well, who would? When you're not getting carbs where they're supposed to go and you have insulin resistance, not only are you starving after you eat the carbs, you can't seem to control the appetite, but you just feel more tired. You just don't feel good eating carbs. Does that mean you shouldn't eat them? No, it means you have to know how to eat them. And that's the ticket in nutrition. It's not eliminating, it's knowing how. That's nutrition science. So what happens is, the recommendation is to start reducing the carbs, and we see a little improvement in the blood sugar, obviously. Or they're going to tell you to exercise more. Of course we're going to see an improvement in the blood sugar because the sugar is going to go into the muscle. But at the same time, we could be making the disease much worse. And why is that a problem? Because if we make that disease much worse, we're going to have these ceramides, which are these fats that are occurring because of insulin resistance, because of type 2 diabetes, and these ceramides themselves can be very damaging to heart tissue, the pancreas. They can cause adult onset type 1 diabetes, the kidney, and also in the brain. Studies show that these ceramides can actually increase the amyloid plaques because they can cause apoptosis, cell death to certain neuronal cells in the brain. Big problem. So this is why with this video, it's so important to understand that the symptoms, which is the glucose and the insulin, aren't so great, but they're not the root cause of the disease. They have their own issues that they're doing, but they're not the root cause of type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance. The root cause of that is not understanding you can only and should only eat a certain amount of fat in your diet if you want to be healthy. And why people recommend for you not to do that is because they're looking at the insulin and the sugar being a big problem. And if I look at the CDC, and it's so confusing because I got to be honest with you, if I'm looking at the CDC and they're talking about what is type 2 diabetes, everybody says it's too much sugar in the blood and too much insulin in the blood. I am not disagreeing with that. That's definitely a symptom of the disease, but it's not the root cause. But you will not find that in the literature. They're not going to explain to you the biochemistry. They're just going to tell you insulin's a problem and sugar's a problem. Not disagreeing. But knowing that information does not help you and can actually make it worse. So let's talk about my patient, Ted. Ted looks fantastic. He's got a six-pack. He just turned 50. And if I look at his in-body results here, he's got a body fat of 17.8. Ideally, we'd like to have him under 20%, so he's well under what's considered a good body fat. He's in great body fat. He's got good muscle mass. When I look at his in-body, he's over 100 on all his segmental lean analysis. He's low in his visceral fat. This test here shows that anything over 10 tells us you have insulin resistance. He's a level 6. Well, of course he is. Ted looks fantastic. He's got a six-pack. No belly fat. He's lean. Works out 2 hours a day. He really watches what he eats, and he tells me, I eat super healthy, vegetarian, eats meat. Maybe he'll eat animal once a month, but he's really doing the avocados, the nuts, the olive oil, all the healthy fats. He watches those carbs. He's in that low-carb lifestyle. He fasts. He monitors his carbs. He does everything he's supposed to. And when he goes to see his doctor says, wow, you're doing great. Because Ted's glucose is 94, nobody would shake a stick at that. Although I might see that as a little bit of a problem because 99 and up means you got too much sugar in the blood. But what they're going to look at with Ted is that his A1C is 5.3, which is a low A1C for a guy his age. What is a A1C that's not so good? Borderline is a 5.7. He's 5.3. And when he was like 10 years before, maybe he was a 4.9. Bottom line, to be a 5.3 in your early 50s, very good, or late 40s. But then we do a 2-hour glucose test on Ted, and we get a totally different picture. Let's talk about a 2-hour glucose test. That's where we give Ted 75 grams of just pure sugar water. Kind of disgusting when you think about it, but that's what it is. It's a little glass of pure sugar water. In the first hour, if you look at Ted's results, we take his blood sugar, we monitor the amount of sugar in his blood after 1 hour, and then we monitor the amount of sugar in his blood after 2 hours. Within 1 hour, he's 179. What does that mean? Well, let me take you back to the diagram. We know that if you're normal and you're in this diagram, within 1 hour, the amount of sugar units you should have in your blood is anything under 140 or less. That's what we know is normal. That's what it should be, because it means within 1 hour, you're getting enough of the sugar into the muscle like you're supposed to. This whole thing was working. But with Ted, that's not happening. He's got some of these receptor sites clogged up. And why do we know that? Because his glucose in his blood is 179. That's considered prediabetes. Now, certainly it's not showing up. And why isn't it showing up? Because he works out 2 hours a day. So every time he works out, he brings the transporter to the surface, and the sugar that would have been in the blood and showed in the blood is going into the muscle. So he's actually lowering his blood sugar every time he works out. So his A1C over a 3-month period, when we take that test, it's going to show low. Plus, he's monitoring his carbs, so he's probably not going to have a lot of insulin in his blood. He's probably not going to have a lot of carbs in his blood. The little bit that's in there, like I said, goes in when he exercises. But he could be setting himself up for diabetes and doesn't know it. The 2-hour glucose test says he's starting it in his late 40s, early 50s. And if he's starting on it, he's also starting with ceramides. These little fats are damaging because they can go to other parts of the body, increase the risk for heart disease, kidney disease, and cognitive decline. Of course, they're not testing ceramides, although they should, and there's been some talk that they might. But until that happens, you don't know it's happening. And his lipid panel could actually be normal. But bottom line, he has insulin resistance with a normal A1C. And his exercise is masking it. Every time he does that, he brings down his sugar in his blood. Also, his diet. But he's worsening the disease. Which then brings me to my patient, John. Now, John is 56. And 16 years ago, he was like Ted. But now, 16 years later, he still exercises. He's put on a little belly fat, 12 to 15 pounds. Still, everybody's like, he looks great. He exercises. He's on a Mediterranean diet, which means absolutely nothing. Because if you're not monitoring your macronutrients, the Mediterranean diet could be all these healthy fats contributing to this. But let's go back to John. John started recently having his A1C be borderline pre-diabetes. By the way, I want to show he's on statins. His cholesterols are beautiful. Everybody's applauding him. He's keeping his weight down. But his doctor's letting him know, we kind of don't like the fact you're 5.7. So his A1C is 5.7. He's borderline pre-diabetes. So we do a 2-hour glucose test on John. And what do we find? Well, we find his insulin's really high. We didn't see that with John. He was just starting 15 years prior. But if you look at what's going on with John versus Ted, John has elevated insulin. So he's got a lot of insulin spewing out. But when we go to his 1 hour, now remember, his A1C is 5.7. Nobody's shaking a stick. He's pre-diabetes, borderline. When we look at his 1 hour, he literally has 205 sugar units. Remember, we want him under 140. Anything over 200 is a diabetic. He literally has insulin resistance the same as a diabetic would. It hasn't shown up yet. He's exercising. He's prolonging it. But the first thing, and also if we look at his 2 hour, it went back down to normal. Well, of course it did. He's pumping out all this insulin. So as you go in the stages of insulin resistance to type 2 diabetes, that's kind of what we'll see. We'll see a lot of insulin, and then eventually as it gets further down, we see less insulin because the pancreas doesn't release as much. So it kind of goes in stages. But bottom line, and the point I'm trying to make, is he will be advised to reduce his carbs because they're going to tell him you really need to monitor those sugars. So his best fix for this is to start exercising so we can bring the sugar out of the blood into the muscle, and let's really monitor the carbs. And sure enough, he goes into his doctor, because I see it, right? And his A1C is down to 5.4. Everybody's super excited for John. John, great job. Maybe he's lost a little weight. Maybe he's doing a little fasting, picking up the trend. Maybe he's doing a keto diet. Bottom line, he's not getting down to the root cause of the disease because he's not understanding that the macronutrients mean something, fat being one of them that I'm addressing in this video. So he can still be developing the disease, but it's being masked by his diet and the fact he's exercising. And if he's at risk for the disease, he's at risk for these ceramides, this lipid toxicity. So let's get right into the science. After I show the biochemistry, then I always think it's good to show you some of the studies. So in this study, they talk about skeletal muscle lipid droplets and the athlete paradox, because it kind of is a little bit of a paradigm shift in your thinking, because you don't ever think of an athlete having insulin resistance, right? But this study literally talks about, in the highlighted area, the available evidence suggests that the lipid droplets is essential to maintaining lipid homeostasis in almost all organisms. In other words, these lipid droplets play an important role in the pathology of metabolic processes, particularly when they're talking in this study about type 2 diabetes, is what they make reference to. Atherosclerosis, they talk about the actual plaque in the artery, and obesity. And they're referring specifically to the degree of insulin resistance and how it is positively correlated with the size of the skeletal muscle lipid droplets. So it goes on in the last highlighted area. Trained athletes accumulate lipids, by the way, lipids are fats, in their skeletal muscle, and lipid droplet size in the muscle tissue is positively correlated with insulin sensitivity. The phenomenon is called athlete's paradox. It's such a paradox because they're saying, wow, these athletes are not eating right. They look great, right? Think of Ted. Six-pack, looks great. Nobody's identifying the issue, but the issue is there. In this study, again, they go further on to talk about these skeletal lipid droplets and the athlete paradox, and they really talk about the chronic positive energy balance results in elevated blood triglycerols and free fatty acids. Those are the fatty acids that circulate that I showed you the picture of, and how this causes a accumulation of these fats in skeletal muscle, liver, and heart. Fats tissue is designed to store fats. Muscles, liver, and hearts are not. But when you have a lot of excess fatty acids, they begin to accumulate in places they shouldn't. So this is in the green highlighted area. I highlight that because I really want to bring home to the fact that in the medical journals, they're referring to this as lipid toxicity. And they say right there, this refers to the fats that cannot be consumed or stored in the fat tissue, and they're stored in non-fat tissue, which is the skeletal muscle, and this causes fat metabolism disorders, lipid metabolism disorders, which is what obesity is, which is what type 2 diabetes is, which is what insulin resistance is, which is what type 3 diabetes dementia is, Alzheimer's, okay? These are definitely fat metabolism disorders. And it talks in the bottom part of this study that lipid toxicity is thought to interfere with normal cellular functions in a process called lipid toxicity. And this is what leads to type 2 diabetes, non-alcohol fatty liver disease, which is another really epidemic in our country. We're seeing a lot of that. So let's go on to some other studies. Excess lipid accumulation in muscle is associated with insulin resistance, a hallmark for early type 2 diabetes. This study talks about lipid accumulation in non-adipose, adipose is fat tissue, and this is referred to as lipid toxicity. And in this study, again, it talks about how exercise and muscle lipid content, the composition, and this again is talking about even if you're exercising, you can have this muscle insulin sensitivity problem because we are not allowing that insulin to function like it should. And in this particular study, they actually made reference to the accumulation of these fats create a type of derivative called a ceramide. And this is what induces cellular toxicity. In the green is where I'm reading from the study. This induces cellular toxicity and insulin signaling defects, which is what type 2 diabetes is, leading to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance results in a failure of insulin-sensitive tissues to respond to the insulin signal. Okay, and that's why we get the hyperglycemia, excess sugar in the blood, and we can have all these other cellular dysfunctions. So really, insulin and sugar are just a symptom of the root cause, which is not understanding you just can't eat all these fats that you want. And in this study, they talk about the sphingolipid metabolism, which is really just a type of fat that a ceramide is, and the new insight into ceramide-induced lipid toxicity in muscle cells. And I mean, I'm just going to keep bringing it home because I think it's good to see a lot of studies saying the same thing from a lot of different sources. And in the green, if you read this study in the green, I've highlighted in situations like obesity and type 2 diabetes, fatty acids from lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fatty acids, and food are in excess and eventually accumulate in peripheral tissue, which is the muscle tissue. What does that one sentence mean? It means that lipolysis is when you're breaking down a lot of fats from your fat cells. And a lot of people think, hooray, that's wonderful. And it is wonderful if you're losing weight and getting rid of a lot of fat cells. But if you're doing a lot of fasting and just breaking down all these fats and letting them drive in circulation and gaining weight, not such a good thing. So these excess circulating fatty acids are a culprit. And they're coming from just too many fatty acids in circulation because you have too much body fat or you're eating too much dietary fat. Both of those can lead to just too much fat. And of course, what good it would be if I didn't bring up a slide that talked about Alzheimer's disease as a type 3 diabetes. You can Google it yourself. Right there, put type 3 diabetes in your browser, and what you're going to come up with all over the place are going to be medical journals that are going to explain it as Alzheimer's, okay? And this is because when you make it hard for some of these cells to get the sugar that they want, not all brain cells, some brain cells, if they get bathed in sugar, it's a big problem. Well, yeah, that happens when you have excess sugar and insulin in your blood. But not all of them are that way. And the other problem are the ceramides that can cause a problem with cell death in the brain. So I'm going to go back to the one macronutrient that I'm really focusing on is the fats. And knowing that all these macronutrients have a purpose. We don't just decide. Dietitians wouldn't be dietitians having to go to school for how many years if all we had to do is just decide what these macronutrients should be. There's a science why, okay, they are the where they are. Okay. Now, I'm not talking about any special medical therapies that would have to be, epilepsy. I can think of a lot of situations where a keto diet's appropriate. Okay, I'm just giving you the science behind one sliver of the pie. So don't roll me under the table because I'm saying this is good for everybody, not the case. But you pretty much have to have some kind of medical condition where some of this isn't going to be what it should be for the average human. And I'm not saying there isn't a percentage of people that would have that. It's understanding the science behind this insulin resistance in type 2 because I don't think we're really getting some clear explanation. So in summary, the whole idea and what I'm trying to bring to the table is that the unaware athletes, active people with insulin resistance that have normal A1Cs and they have metabolic dysfunction and they're not aware. They are setting themselves up for insulin resistance, which is associated with diabetes, obesity, an appetite that's deregulated, tough to lose weight. But the worst part about it, especially after the age of 50, you're setting yourself up for risk of dementia, heart disease, fatty liver, and chronic inflammation. Insulin resistance, which is type 2 diabetes decades before, is preventable with the right diet. Active adults unaware of the risk because we're not looking at the right biomarkers. So I hope this helps. I also want to thank everybody who's purchased my book, which has just been out in the last 2 months, and it's been #1 on Amazon, Why Your Diets Fail and the Science That Really Works. Now, this book literally is a plane ride read, and that's how I designed it. I wanted you to be able to pick it up and get through it and understand the science behind these macronutrients. I do talk a little bit about insulin resistance in there, but for $2.99, that's $2.99 on Kindle, I don't think you can afford not to buy it. So I'm just doing that little plug, not that I'm trying to get rich on $2.99. I'm really wanting you to understand the science behind the nutrition. And also, I have a website. You can go in there. You can get on my membership, my nutrition membership. And that's all I do is help you understand how to balance these macronutrients so that you don't set yourself up for these metabolic diseases. Also, I want to thank everybody. I'm so excited because we're up to 820 followers or subscribers. I don't know the right terminology. Subscribers. Okay. Thank you. So appreciate it. And it drives me to work even harder to bring it to you. Also, we want to check, Sam, do we have any chats?
We have one from
Patty. Awesome. Important information that people are not aware of. Thank you so much. Thank you, Patty, for joining. So if we don't have any other comments, until next week, we're going to bring you something else super cool, super important that impacts your life.